Maybe it's time you leave, my daughter-in-law said, her voice light enough to sound polite, but sharp enough to slice through everything I thought I still had. The room didn't go silent the way it does in movies. Instead, it stayed painfully normal, forks scraping against plates, glasses clinking softly, someone shifting in their chair, as if nothing had just happened. I remember noticing the smell of roasted chicken, the kind I used to make every Sunday for decades, and thinking how strange it was that something so familiar could feel so distant. I looked at Ashley, really looked at her, her posture straight, her smile controlled, her eyes already moving past me like I was no longer part of the scene, and then I turned to my son. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't even look surprised. He just kept his gaze lowered, cutting his food into careful, even pieces, like if he focused hard enough, he wouldn't have to acknowledge what had just been said. That was the moment I understood this wasn't sudden. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This had been decided long before tonight. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table, not enough for anyone to notice, just enough to ground myself in the reality of it. For 68 years, I had believed that family meant something permanent, something unshakable, something that didn't disappear in the middle of a Tuesday night dinner. And yet, there I was, sitting at the same table I had paid for, in the house I had helped build, being told, gently and clearly, that I no longer belonged. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't remind them of the years I had spent raising Daniel on my own after his father passed, or the nights I stayed up worrying about bills, or the sacrifices that had quietly shaped every inch of that home. None of that would have mattered, not in that moment. Instead, I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, the same way I had taught Daniel to do when he was a boy, and I stood up. My chair made a soft sound against the hardwood floor, nothing dramatic, nothing that would interrupt the rhythm of their meal. For a second, I thought someone might say my name, that Daniel might finally look up and realize what was happening, but no one did. Ashley reached for her glass of water. Daniel kept eating. It was as if I had already disappeared, as if I had become invisible before I even took a step away from the table. I walked toward the hallway slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I refused to rush out like I had done something wrong. My hand brushed against the wall where family photos used to hang, though most of them had been replaced recently with newer ones where I appeared less and less, until eventually, I wasn't there at all. I hadn't noticed when that change began, or maybe I had and simply chose not to question it. The house felt different as I moved through it, not hostile, not even cold, just unfamiliar in a way that made everything echo slightly louder than it should have. I paused near the front door, my reflection faint in the glass, and for a brief moment, I studied the woman looking back at me. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her blouse still crisp, her expression calm. Too calm, perhaps. Because beneath that stillness, something had shifted. Not broken. Not yet. But shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I reached for my coat, the same beige one I had worn for years, and slipped it on with steady hands. Behind me, I could still hear the soft murmur of conversation continuing at the table, as if the evening had simply adjusted itself to my absence. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, standing at the threshold of a house that no longer felt like mine, I realized something far more important than what Ashley had said or what Daniel had failed to say. They thought this was the end of my place in their lives. They thought I would leave quietly and disappear just as easily as I had stood up from that table. And maybe, for a long time, I would have done exactly that. But as I opened the door and stepped into the cool evening air, I felt a clarity settle over me, sharp and undeniable. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. And that was their first mistake. I did not finish the coffee. I left it half full on the table, the surface barely disturbed, as if even that small detail reflected the way something in my life had been interrupted without warning. I stepped outside again, the night air now cooler than before, and paused beside my car without immediately getting in. The street was quieter, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the bones of a neighborhood after most people have gone to bed. I looked up at the dark sky for a moment, not searching for anything, just allowing the stillness to settle into me. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone again, this time not to check for messages, but to find a number I had not dialed in a very long time. It was still there, saved under a name I had almost forgotten I needed. I hesitated for a brief second, not out of doubt, but because I understood that this call would mark a line I could not step back across. Then I pressed it. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm and measured, unchanged by time. "Margaret," he said, and there was a quiet recognition in his tone that made something in my chest tighten, not with emotion, but with certainty. "It has been a while." I let out a slow breath before replying. "Yes, it has, Thomas. I hope I am not calling too late." There was a soft pause on the other end, the kind that carries more understanding than questions. "You are not," he said. "What can I do for you?" I glanced back at the empty parking lot, at the reflection of the diner's neon sign flickering faintly in the window, and chose my words carefully. "I need to review everything," I said. "All of it. The house, the accounts, the documents my husband left behind." Another pause, slightly longer this time, but not uncertain. "I wondered when you might call," Thomas replied. "Are you somewhere safe?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight I could not ignore. I considered it for a moment, then answered honestly. "I am somewhere quiet," I said. "And for the first time in a long while, I think I can see things clearly." He did not ask for details. He did not need them. "Then come by my office tomorrow morning," he said. 9 o'clock. "Bring anything you have. We will go through it together." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "Thank you," I said, and when I ended the call, I felt something settle into place inside me, something steady and deliberate. I slipped the phone back into my purse and finally got into the car, closing the door with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. This time, I knew exactly where I was going. My sister's house was about 20 minutes away, just across town, in a neighborhood that still felt familiar in a way the house I had just left no longer did. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, the road ahead clear and empty. As I drove, the thoughts returned, but they were different now. No longer scattered. No longer uncertain. They moved in a straight line, connecting one detail to the next with quiet precision. I remembered the envelope I had seen on the kitchen counter a week ago, the one Ashley had quickly moved when I walked in. I remembered the way Daniel had dismissed my question about property taxes, saying everything was handled. I remembered the new locks on the study door, the room that used to belong to my husband, now always closed. At the time, each of those moments had seemed small, easy to overlook, easy to excuse. But now, they aligned too neatly to be coincidence. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel just slightly, not out of fear, but out of focus. They had not simply decided I should leave. They had been preparing for it. The realization did not bring anger. It brought clarity. And clarity, I had learned, was far more useful. When I reached my sister's house, the porch light was already on, casting a soft glow across the front yard. She must have seen my car pull up, because the door opened before I even reached the steps. "Margaret," she said, her voice filled with quiet concern, but she did not ask questions right away. She simply stepped aside and let me in. The warmth of the house wrapped around me as I crossed the threshold, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel it. Not as comfort, but as contrast. "You can stay as long as you need," she said gently, and I gave a small nod in response. "Just for a few days," I replied. "I have something I need to take care of first." She studied my face for a second, as if trying to read what I was not saying, then nodded. "All right," she said. "We will talk in the morning." I placed my purse on the small table by the door and glanced around the room, taking in the familiar details, the photographs, the furniture, the quiet sense of order that had not been disturbed. Then I turned slightly, catching my reflection in the hallway mirror. For a moment, I stood there, looking at the woman staring back at me, and I realized she no longer looked uncertain. She looked composed. Focused. Ready. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my blouse, a small, deliberate gesture, and then let my hand fall back to my side. Tomorrow, I would sit across from Thomas and uncover everything they thought I would never question. Tomorrow, I would see the full shape of what had been happening behind closed doors. And whatever I found, I already knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not be the one leaving empty-handed. The morning came quietly, without urgency, without the weight I had expected it to carry. I woke before my sister did, the soft light of early sunrise filtering through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the room. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the faint hum of the house around me, the distant sound of a car passing outside, the steady rhythm of a world that had not changed, even though mine had. I sat up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my blouse as if the simple act could anchor me in something familiar, something controlled. There was no rush. There was no panic. Only a clear sequence of steps waiting to be followed. I dressed carefully, choosing each piece with intention, not for appearance, but for the quiet discipline it required. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, my sister was already there, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. She looked up, her eyes searching mine for something she did not yet understand, but she did not press. She simply handed me a cup. "You slept?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Enough," I replied. It was the truth, though not in the way she might have meant. We sat at the table in silence, the kind that did not demand to be filled, and after a few minutes, I set the cup down. "I have an appointment," I said. 9 o'clock. She glanced at the clock, then back at me. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked. I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "This is something I need to do on my own." She held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right," she said. "Call me if you need anything." I gave a small nod in return and stood, picking up my purse from the counter. The drive to Thomas's office felt different from the night before. The roads were busier now, filled with the movement of people starting their day, unaware of the quiet shift unfolding beneath the surface of mine. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the car for a brief moment, looking at the building in front of me. It had not changed. The same brick exterior, the same polished glass doors, the same understated sign bearing his name. I stepped out, closed the car door with a soft click, and walked inside. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, one that carried recognition but not familiarity, and asked me to wait. I sat in the chair near the window, placing my purse neatly on my lap, and let my eyes move across the room. Everything was orderly. Predictable. Controlled. It was a stark contrast to the quiet disorder I had left behind. When Thomas appeared in the doorway, he did not smile, but his expression held something more meaningful than politeness. "Understanding." "Margaret," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. His office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that suggested permanence, structure, something that could not be easily undone. I took a seat across from his desk and placed my purse beside me, folding my hands together as I met his gaze. He did not waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he opened a folder already waiting on his desk, its contents neatly organized, each document aligned with deliberate precision. "Your husband anticipated many things," he said calmly. "But I do not believe he anticipated that you would wait this long to look." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, my attention fixed on the papers before me. "Show me," I said. Thomas nodded once and turned the first page toward me. The words were formal, structured, written in the language of law, but the meaning beneath them was clear enough. Ownership. Control. Conditions. I read carefully, not rushing, not skipping ahead, allowing each line to settle before moving to the next. As I did, the pieces I had begun to notice the night before started to take shape in a way that was no longer abstract. The house. The accounts. The authority over decisions that had quietly shifted without my awareness. Or rather, without my acknowledgement. Thomas spoke occasionally, clarifying a term, pointing to a clause, but mostly he let the documents speak for themselves. And they did. By the time I reached the final page, I sat back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, the initial weight of uncertainty replaced by something far more defined. They assumed, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, that I would not question any of this. Thomas met my gaze without hesitation. They assumed you would trust them, he replied. I let that settle for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They were right about that, I said. Until now. I reached forward and closed the folder gently, my fingertips resting on the cover for a brief second before pulling my hand back. The room felt quieter than before, not empty, but focused, as if everything had narrowed down to a single point of clarity. What are my options? I asked. Thomas did not hesitate. You have more than they think, he said. And as I sat there, listening, absorbing, understanding the full extent of what had been set in motion long before that dinner table moment, I felt something settle into place with absolute certainty. This had never been about asking me to leave. It had been about removing me from something they believed they already controlled. And now, finally, I understood exactly how wrong they were. Thomas did not rush his explanation, and I appreciated that. He moved through each document with a kind of quiet precision, pointing out clauses that had been written years ago, long before Ashley had ever stepped into our lives, long before Daniel had begun to drift into a version of himself I no longer recognized. Your husband structured everything carefully, Thomas said, his voice even. He placed the house, the primary accounts, and several key assets under a trust. You are the primary beneficiary and the controlling party. I listened without interrupting, my eyes following the lines of text again, this time with a sharper understanding. Daniel is listed, Thomas continued, but not in the way he may believe. His access is conditional. It always was. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle in. Conditional. That was the word that mattered. What kind of conditions? I asked. Thomas folded his hands together on the desk, his expression steady. Oversight, for one. Any major decision involving the property requires your approval. Sale, transfer, restructuring. None of it can proceed without your direct authorization. I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but alignment. Pieces clicking into place where confusion had been before. And if those conditions are ignored? I asked. Thomas did not hesitate. Then the authority reverts entirely to you. Immediately. Without dispute. The room felt very still after that. I glanced down at the folder again, at the signatures, the dates, the deliberate language that had been there all along, waiting. Waiting for me to see it. They have been acting as if they already own everything, I said quietly. Thomas gave a slight nod. That is often the assumption, he replied. Especially when no one challenges it. I let out a slow breath, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. They changed the locks on his study, I said after a moment. They have been handling the mail. Redirecting documents. Thomas's gaze sharpened slightly, not with surprise, but with recognition. That would be consistent with an attempt to consolidate control, he said. But control and ownership are not the same thing. I nodded once. That distinction was clearer to me now than it had ever been. What do I need to do? I asked. Thomas reached for another document, sliding it toward me. First, we establish your position formally. We document any actions taken without your consent. We secure access to all accounts and properties. And then, he paused briefly, we decide how you want to proceed. I looked at the paper in front of me, then back at him. How I want to proceed, I repeated, letting the words settle. It had been a long time since I had considered that question in any real way. For years, my decisions had been shaped by what was best for Daniel, for the family, for maintaining a sense of balance that I now realized had only existed on the surface. But this was different. This was not about preserving something that had already been quietly dismantled. This was about recognizing what still remained and choosing what to do with it. I do not want a confrontation, I said finally. Not yet. Thomas inclined his head slightly. That is often the most effective approach, he said. Clarity first. Action second. I gave a small nod in agreement. They believe I left, I continued. They believe I accepted what was said at that table. Thomas's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his tone when he spoke next. And have you? He asked. I held his gaze for a moment, then shook my head. No, I said simply. The word felt solid, anchored in something deeper than emotion. It was not defiance. It was fact. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. Then we proceed accordingly, he said. I reached for the pen he had placed beside the document and signed where he indicated, my hand steady, the motion deliberate. When I finished, I set the pen down carefully and closed the folder once more. I will need copies of everything, I said. Of course, he replied. You will have them before you leave. As he gathered the papers, organizing them with the same quiet precision, I sat there for a moment, letting the reality of what I had just confirmed settle fully into place. The house had not been taken from me. It had been assumed. The authority had not been lost. It had been ignored. And now, for the first time, I understood exactly where I stood. When Thomas handed me the documents, I accepted them with a small nod of thanks and rose from my seat. Margaret, he said as I turned toward the door. I paused and looked back. Do not underestimate how quickly assumptions can unravel once they are challenged. I held his gaze for a brief moment, then gave a slight nod. I will keep that in mind, I said. As I stepped out of his office and into the hallway, the quiet hum of the building surrounding me once again, I felt no urgency, no need to rush. There was time now. Time to move carefully, to observe, to act when it mattered. They believed the decision had already been made. They believed the outcome was settled. But as I walked toward the exit, the documents secure in my hand, I knew something they did not. Nothing had been decided. Not yet. I did not go back to my sister's house right away. Instead, I sat in my car for a moment outside Thomas's office, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me, its weight far greater than the papers inside should have allowed. The late morning sun reflected faintly off the windshield, casting a soft glare that made everything beyond it seem slightly distant, as if the world had shifted just enough to remind me that I was no longer moving through it the same way. I reached over and placed my hand on the envelope, not opening it again, not needing to. I already knew what it contained. What mattered now was not what I had learned, but what I chose to do with it. I started the engine slowly and pulled out onto the street, merging into the steady flow of traffic without hesitation. This time, I did not drive without direction. I knew exactly where I was going. As I approached the neighborhood, the familiarity returned, but it no longer carried the same sense of belonging. The houses lined the street just as they always had, each one carefully maintained, each one holding its own version of quiet routines and unspoken stories. Mine stood at the end of the block, unchanged from the outside, its windows reflecting the sky, its front yard trimmed and orderly. If someone had passed by, they would have seen nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that anything inside had shifted. I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway, turning off the engine and sitting there for a moment as I looked at the house. There was no urgency in me, no impulse to rush back in or to confront anyone. That was not why I was here. I reached into my purse and pulled out the spare key I had kept for years, the one I had not needed to use in a long time. I turned it slowly between my fingers, feeling the familiar edges, the quiet certainty of something that had not changed, even when everything else had. Then I stepped out of the car and crossed the street. The sound of my footsteps on the pavement was steady, measured, each one deliberate. When I reached the front door, I paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but to take in the moment for exactly what it was. Then I inserted the key and turned it. the lock clicked open without resistance. I stepped inside. The house was quiet. Not empty, but quiet in a way that suggested no one was expecting anything to change. The air carried the faint scent of the same cleaning products Ashley preferred, sharp and overly floral, masking the warmth the house used to hold. I closed the door gently behind me and stood still for a moment, listening. No voices. No movement. Just the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant ticking of the wall clock. I moved forward slowly, my eyes taking in the details with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. The furniture had been rearranged slightly. Subtle, but intentional. The framed photographs on the shelves had been replaced again, this time almost entirely with images I was not part of. I walked past them without stopping, not because they did not matter, but because I understood now that they were only the surface of something much deeper. When I reached the study door, I noticed immediately what I had expected. The lock had been changed. The handle no longer matched the rest of the house, its polished finish standing out against the older wood. I rested my hand lightly against it, not trying to open it, just acknowledging what it represented. Then I stepped back. I did not need to force it. Not yet. Instead, I turned and walked into the kitchen. The counter was clean, everything placed neatly in its designated spot, as if order itself could justify the decisions that had been made within these walls. I set my purse down gently and placed the envelope beside it, aligning it carefully with the edge of the counter. Then I reached for a pen from the drawer and pulled a single sheet of paper from the stack beneath it. I sat down at the table, the same table where I had been told to leave, and for a moment, I let my hand rest against the surface. The wood was smooth, familiar, unchanged. Then I began to write. My movements were calm, deliberate, each word chosen with care. Not emotional. Not reactive. Just clear. When I finished, I folded the paper once and placed it in the center of the table, where it would not be missed. I stood up, glanced once around the room, and picked up the envelope again. I did not stay longer than necessary. I did not open doors or search for anything else. That was not the purpose of this visit. As I walked back toward the front door, I felt no anger, no hesitation, only a quiet sense of alignment between what I knew and what I was about to do. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and locked it with the same key. The click was soft, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a finality that settled deep. As I walked back to my car, the house behind me looked exactly the same as it had before. Unchanged. Undisturbed. But I knew better now. And soon, they would too. They did not call me that afternoon. Not while I was driving away from the house, not while I sat in my sister's living room with the envelope resting quietly beside me, not even as the hours passed and the sun began to lower in the sky. The silence stretched in a way that would have once made me uneasy, but now it only confirmed what I had already understood. They had not noticed yet. Or perhaps they had, and they were choosing not to react. Either way, it did not matter. I sat in the same chair by the window, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the light shift across the room as time moved forward without interruption. My sister moved around the house quietly, giving me space without needing to be told. She understood enough to know that whatever was happening did not require questions. It required patience. Around 5 o'clock, my phone finally vibrated against the table. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring once, then twice, allowing the moment to settle before I picked it up and looked at the screen. Daniel. His name appeared exactly as it always had, unchanged, familiar, but now carrying a weight it had never held before. I answered calmly. Hello, Daniel. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had expected something different. Mom, he said, his voice uncertain in a way I had not heard in years. Where are you? I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze steady. I am somewhere safe, I replied. Is there something you need? Another pause, longer this time. I could hear faint movement in the background, the distant echo of the house, of that table, of the place I had left behind. We came home, he said slowly. And you were not here. I let that settle between us before responding. That is correct, I said. His breath shifted slightly, a subtle change in rhythm that told me more than his words ever could. There is a note, he added. On the table. I glanced toward the window, watching as the last light of the afternoon stretched across the glass. Yes, I said. There is. Silence followed. Not empty, but heavy with everything he was not saying. I could almost see him standing there, the paper in his hand, Ashley nearby, both of them trying to understand something they had assumed was already resolved. What does it mean? He asked finally. The question was simple, but it carried uncertainty now, not authority. I allowed myself a brief moment before answering. It means exactly what it says, I replied. That no decisions regarding that house, or anything connected to it, can be made without my approval. Another silence. This one sharper. Mom, he began, his tone shifting slightly, we were only trying to. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt harshly. I simply spoke. Daniel, I said calmly, and he stopped. That alone told me everything I needed to know. You were not trying to include me, I continued. You were trying to remove me. The words were not emotional. They were not accusatory. They were precise. I could hear his breath catch slightly, the way it used to when he was younger, and realized he had been caught in something he could not explain. It is not like that, he said quickly, but the certainty was gone from his voice. I let the silence stretch again before responding. Then we will discuss it properly, I said. With all the documents in front of us. With everything clear. There was movement on his end, a faint murmur that suggested Ashley was speaking to him, though I could not make out the words. He lowered his voice slightly. You talked to someone, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I replied. I did. Another pause. Then, more carefully, who? I glanced down at the envelope beside me, my fingers resting lightly against its edge. That is not important right now, I said. What matters is that nothing moves forward without me. The line went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Calculation. We should talk, Daniel said finally. In person. I nodded once, even though he could not see it. We will, I replied. Soon. I ended the call before he could say anything more, placing the phone back on the table with the same calm precision I had maintained since leaving the house. My sister looked up from across the room, her expression questioning but patient. They called? She asked softly. I gave a small nod. Yes, I said. They did. She studied me for a moment, then asked the only question that mattered. And? I turned my gaze back to the window, where the light had now faded completely, leaving only the reflection of the room behind me. They are beginning to understand, I said quietly. I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, feeling its weight again, not as something heavy, but as something steady. Something certain. Then I set it back down. The conversation had started. Not the one at the dinner table. That one had already ended. This was a different conversation now. One they were not prepared for. And this time I would not be the one standing up and leaving. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet inevitability, as if everything that had been set in motion the day before was now simply waiting to unfold. I dressed with the same deliberate care, choosing calm over haste, precision over emotion, and by the time I stepped out of my sister's house, there was no uncertainty left in me. The meeting had already been decided. Not by them, but by me. I arrived at the house 10 minutes early, parking in the driveway this time, not across the street. The front door opened before I reached it, and Daniel stood there, his expression caught somewhere between expectation and unease. Ashley stood a few steps behind him, her posture composed, her face carefully neutral. But her eyes sharper than before, watching me in a way that suggested she was already measuring what had changed. I stepped inside without hesitation, the familiar space greeting me with that same controlled stillness, but now it felt different. Not because the house had changed, but because I had. "Mom," Daniel said, closing the door behind me. "Thank you for coming." I gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement, but as recognition of the moment. "We should sit," I said calmly, and without waiting for a response, I walked toward the dining table. They followed. The same table. The same chairs. The same arrangement that had felt so final just hours before. I took my seat at the head, the place I had always occupied, and placed the envelope in front of me with quiet precision. Daniel hesitated for a brief second before sitting across from me. Ashley remained standing for a moment longer, then took her seat beside him, her movements controlled, deliberate. No one spoke at first. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was focused. "You read the note," I said finally, my voice even. Daniel nodded. "We did," he replied. "But we think there may be some misunderstanding." I met his gaze without shifting. "There is no misunderstanding," I said. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her expression composed but firm. "Margaret," she said, her tone measured, "we were only trying to make things easier for everyone. The house is too much for you to manage alone, and we thought it would be better if—" I raised my hand slightly, not abruptly, but enough to stop her. She fell silent. "You thought it would be better," I repeated, my voice calm. "Without asking me. Without informing me. Without including me in any part of that decision." The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. They were clear. Daniel shifted in his seat, his hands clasping together on the table. "We were going to talk to you," he said, but the sentence lacked conviction even as he spoke it. I did not respond to that. Instead, I reached forward and opened the envelope, sliding a set of documents across the table toward them. "Before you say anything else," I said, "you should read these." Daniel glanced at Ashley, then picked up the papers, his eyes moving quickly at first, then slowing as the meaning began to settle. Ashley leaned in closer, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as she read over his shoulder. The room grew quieter with each passing second. I watched them without interruption, without expression, allowing the silence to do what words could not. When Daniel finally looked up, his face had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The certainty that had been there before was gone, replaced by something far less stable. This says you have full control," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. Ashley straightened in her chair, her composure still intact, but her voice carried a sharper edge now. "There must be some error," she said. Daniel was told what he wanted to believe," I said calmly, cutting through the sentence without raising my voice. She stopped. I continued. "The structure has not changed. It has always been this way. The difference is that I have now reviewed it." Daniel looked back down at the papers, as if reading them again might change what they said. "So, what does this mean?" he asked. The question was quieter this time. I folded my hands lightly on the table. "It means," I said, "that no decisions regarding this house, or anything connected to it, will be made without my approval. It means that any actions taken without that approval are invalid. And it means," I paused briefly, allowing the weight of the words to settle, "that I am not leaving." The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was definitive. Ashley's gaze remained fixed on me, her expression controlled, but the calculation behind it had shifted. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as the reality of the situation settled in. No one spoke for several seconds. Then, quietly, almost carefully, Daniel asked, "What happens now?" I held his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Now," I said, "we proceed properly." And as I sat there, in the same chair, at the same table where everything had seemed to end, I understood with absolute clarity that nothing had ended at all. It had only just begun. No one moved immediately after I spoke. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. I watched Daniel closely, not as a mother looking at her son, but as someone observing a man trying to understand a reality he had not prepared for. His eyes moved between the documents and my face, searching for something that would soften what had just been made clear. There was none. Ashley, on the other hand, did not look away. She held my gaze with a composure that had not entirely left her, but there was something different now, something less certain, as if the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she could not immediately correct. "We can figure this out," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than before, less assured. I did not respond right away. Instead, I let the silence remain, giving his words the space to exist without rushing to fill it. Then I spoke. "There is nothing to figure out," I said calmly. "There is only what is already in place." Ashley leaned back slightly, her fingers resting against the edge of the table, her posture still controlled, but her expression more guarded. "Margaret," she said, her tone measured, "no one is trying to take anything from you." I tilted my head just slightly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement of the statement itself. "That is not what your actions suggest," I replied. The room fell quiet again. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years ago when he felt cornered by something he could not immediately fix. "We made a mistake," he said. The words came carefully, as if each one had to pass through something before being spoken. I looked at him for a moment, not searching for sincerity, but recognizing it when it appeared. "Yes," I said. "You did." There was no anger in my voice. No accusation. Just a simple acknowledgement of fact. Ashley shifted slightly beside him, her expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing again. "What do you want?" she asked. The question was direct now, stripped of pretense. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, my posture unchanged. "I want clarity," I said. "I want every decision regarding this house, every document, every account, to be reviewed properly. Together. With full transparency." Daniel nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Of course," he said. "We can do that." I held his gaze, steady and unwavering. "And I want something else," I added. He hesitated slightly, then nodded again. "What?" I did not look at Ashley when I answered. I looked only at him. "I want you to understand that I am not an obstacle to be managed," I said. "I am not a problem to be solved. I am the person who built this life you are standing in." The words were not raised. They did not need to be. They settled into the space between us with a weight that did not require emphasis. Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment, then looked back up, something quieter now in his expression. "I understand," he said. I did not respond to that. Understanding, I had learned, was not something proven in a single moment. It revealed itself over time. Ashley remained silent, her gaze shifting briefly toward the documents before returning to me. "And if we do this your way?" she asked. "Then what?" I met her eyes fully for the first time since sitting down. "Then we move forward," I said. "Properly. Without assumptions. Without decisions being made in silence." She studied me for a moment longer, as if measuring the boundaries of something she had not anticipated needing to respect. Then she gave a small, controlled nod. No agreement spoken. But no objection either. That was enough. I reached forward and gathered the documents back into the envelope, my movements calm, deliberate, final in their own quiet way. Then I stood. The chair slid back softly against the floor, the same sound it had made the night before, but it carried a different meaning now. Daniel stood as well, almost instinctively. "Are you leaving?" he asked. I paused for a brief moment, looking at him, then at the room around us, at the table, the walls, the space that had once felt so certain. "No," I said. "I am simply not staying the same." I turned and walked toward the front door, not because I had been asked to leave, but because I had chosen to step away on my own terms. When I reached it, I paused briefly, my hand resting against the handle, and for a moment, I allowed myself to take in the stillness of the house behind me. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The air felt different this time. Not colder. Not heavier. Just clearer. As I walked down the path, I did not look back. I did not need to. Because everything that needed to be seen had already been made visible. And everything that needed to be understood had already begun to take shape. They had believed that moment at the table defined where I stood. They had believed my silence meant I had nothing left to say. But as I reached my car and opened the door, I understood something with absolute certainty. I had not lost my place. I had simply stopped allowing them to decide what it was.